This is our Young Heretics episode about Stoic philosophy in Rome. Let me tell you a story about philosophy in Rome. This is a story which comes from Plutarch, whom we've talked about a little bit before, 1st to 2nd century AD writer. And this is the life of Cato the Elder, a story, a biography of this really rather stern figure. Lives from 234 to 149 BC, so a figure of Republican Rome who held the office of censor, which was sort of really the highest authority in Rome. Here's what Plutarch has to say. When Cato was now well on in years, there came as ambassadors from Athens to Rome Carneades the academic and Diogenes the Stoic philosopher, to beg the reversal of a certain decision against the Athenian people, which imposed upon them a fine of 500 talents. The people of Oropus had brought the suit. The Athenians had let the case go by default, and the Sicyonians had pronounced judgment against them. Upon the arrival of these philosophers, the most studious of the city's youth hastened to wait upon them, and became their devoted and admiring listeners. The charm of Carneades especially, which had boundless power, and a fame not inferior to its power, won large and sympathetic audiences, and filled the city like a rushing mighty wind with the noise of his praises. Report spread far and wide that a Greek of amazing talent, who disarmed all opposition by the magic of his eloquence, had infused a tremendous passion into the youth of the city, in consequence of which they forsook their other pleasures and pursuits, and were possessed about philosophy. The other Romans were pleased at this, and glad to see their young men lay hold of Greek culture and consort with such admirable men. But Cato, at the very outset, when this zeal for discussion came pouring into the city, was distressed, fearing lest the young men, by giving this direction to their ambition, should come to love a reputation based on mere words more than one achieved by martial deeds. And before we get into it, I'm just going to remind you about locals, because a lot of folks have been reaching out to me about how to get around big tech, how to make sure that this community we've been building together can survive as censorship grows and as Twitter and Facebook and Google continue their crackdown. Well, locals is the answer, and you can both support the show, help keep it going, and also get all kinds of extra stuff if you go to youngheretics.com/locals and become a VIP member. What you get is you get the episodes a week in advance without ads. You can be on a video mailbag where you can be on the show and ask me questions. And then I'll do all sorts of other stuff. I've already written a bunch of articles up there. You can get live Q&As. We'll do live streams, a bunch of stuff. And really, you can be part of building this show together if you become a Young Heretics VIP by going now to youngheretics.com/locals. So, why did I begin with this story from Plutarch about the philosophical embassy to Rome? Well, the Diogenes mentioned in there is Diogenes of Babylon, who is one of the Stoic scholarchs, the third head of the Stoa, which is the place in Athens where these folks who eventually became Stoics would meet. Now, the reaction of Cato, who remember is this moralist, this stern Republican Roman, is representative of a tension in Roman society, really from the outset, but especially as Rome, as I've discussed before, starts to expand outward into the Mediterranean and to take over all of these different territories that previously had seemed vastly beyond Rome. Because remember, as we've talked about, right, Rome begins as this agrarian society. It's surrounded by older civilizations, by cultures that seem to surpass it, and then it starts to just take over the world, to win victory in war. In many cases, to gobble up those territories that I've talked about these last couple episodes. I mentioned that when Alexander died, the territories that he had accrued unto himself broke up into these different kingdoms: the Ptolemaic kingdoms in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, and so forth. So these were these kingdoms that eventually all came under the sway of Rome. And in particular, there was a very complicated relationship with Greece and with the cultural products of Athens especially. Horace, one of the great Augustan poets, would eventually write that Greece conquered conquered her savage captor, meaning that Greek culture was so alluring, so sophisticated, and we've already now for many episodes luxuriated in the sort of high noon of Athenian art and philosophy. It was so alluring that Rome basically felt small, even though it was conquering the world. It felt small by comparison. And Virgil in the Aeneid has Anchises say to Aeneas, his son, the ghost of Aeneas' father, says to him, other cultures are going to be better at sculpture. They may be better at astronomy. Your job is to bring peace to the world with the art of war. But this is a tension because there's something just very noble, inherently elevated about philosophy and the life of the mind and art as well. And so there were some, like Cato, who were incredibly suspicious of being corrupted by this Hellenic influence. And there were others who really, like Cicero, who hugely admired not only the Stoics, but also, the sort of inheritors of the Platonic Academy, and were kind of all about just taking, it was like, this is what Polybius says about the Romans, that they're all about cultural appropriation. And there was a version of this in Rome, it affected every area of life. In oratory, there was this debate between the Atticists, who sort of imitated the great Athenian orators like Demosthenes, and then the Asianists, who were a little bit more florid in their diction. But then in art too, and in philosophy. So we're getting now to the kind of Stoicism that made its way to Rome. When we started this journey, I said, the Roman Stoicism is really kind of what we think of when we think of Stoicism, even though the Stoa itself, right, the location where they get their name, and the origins of the school with Zeno of Citium, and, the whole kind of cosmological, philosophical life outlook that I described back in that episode, that all originates in Greece, and yet Rome is the great exporter of not only Greek but also eventually Christian ideas to the world. And so many times when we kind of approach these things in popular imagination, we approach them through the Romans. Today, there were a number of representatives of Stoicism in Rome. Seneca the Younger is one famous one. The one that we're really going to focus on is also probably the most famous one, which is Marcus Aurelius. This is mostly an episode about Marcus Aurelius as a representative of how Stoic ethics especially, but also the Stoic outlook more generally, made its way into this rougher, more warlike and bigger society, and eventually then got sort of exported out into the world. Before we jump in, a word briefly from our sponsors. This is my friends at the Ancient Language Institute, who are teaching people in a kind of living language way how to speak Latin and Greek. And you can get not just Attic Greek, which is the classical form, but also Koine Greek, which is the form in which you read the Bible. This is something I advocate hugely. It's a crucial part, I think, of getting deeper into these texts that really founded the Western world. And they've got all sorts of exciting programming coming up. Right now, you can sign up for one-on-one tutoring, which is great. I highly recommend it. Or you can sign up for their group classes, which will be coming back around as the new semester starts. But those won't be able to start immediately. So what you do is you go to ancientlanguage.com/heretics and use the promo code heretics, HERETICS, just like in the title. And you get 15% off to get started. So that's HERETICS, just like in the title of the show, ancientlanguage.com/heretics. So Marcus Aurelius, big name. People probably have seen the sculpture of him with, he's on horseback raising one hand. A tremendously compelling figure, especially these days for young men who want to recover a sense of their masculinity. I think that's one reason why Stoicism is so much in vogue right now, is that we have this really insidious attack on masculine virtues and on the idea that men should aspire to manliness. I've talked about this before. I've defended the idea both of masculinity and femininity as inherently beautiful, natural, and complementary halves of human society, human life. And you can just imagine, I don't like to talk about woke people that much on this show, because the whole point is we kind of leave them at the door and we get the classical education that they want to deny us. But there is a book, if you're kind of interested in like peering into the heart of this stuff, there's a book called Not All Dead White Men, which is by Donna Zuckerberg, who is the sister of Mark Zuckerberg, who runs Facebook. So it's all this like big axis of evil. But Zuckerberg I don't want to like rag on her too much. She's shocked and appalled that people are getting into Stoicism because of the retrograde attitudes that it encourages about gender and sex, such as that sex and gender are not completely fabricated, but actually have some reality in the world. So Aurelius has become this role model, and I think he really merits that. He's a tremendously appealing figure. He leaves behind this, it's really a set of notes to himself, and that's sort of its original Greek title, Eis He Auton, to himself, but we know it as Meditations. And it's it's self-talk, it's self-help, but it's also rules for life in a way, and it derives all from this sort of Stoic mentality and Stoic mindset. And I want to be clear here because look, we are talking about these philosophies. We're leading up to talking about Christianity's engagement with them, and I can't escape the fact that I am a Christian, right? I can't lie to you and just endorse these philosophies. But neither do I want to come across as disrespectful of them, because I'm actually, one of the reasons I'm doing all these episodes, I think they're really worth understanding and puzzling over and comparing to one another, and experimenting with also, right? To sort of see which ones of them, which ideas work in your life and which ones don't. And so I don't just want to come across as trashing these guys. I'm actually here because I feel a tremendous empathy toward them. And Marcus Aurelius especially, I can kind of connect with. It's really easy to get this sort of, it feels like this direct picture of his mind. He was kind of never supposed to be emperor. It was sort of chain of adoptions in 137 AD. Hadrian, who himself had been adopted by Trajan, adopts Lucius Caonius Commodus to succeed him. Then that Commodus dies, and he has this successor Antoninus, and he's adopted on condition that he adopt Marcus Aurelius. And so it's this really kind of improbable. If you've watched The Crown and the opening of the first season of The Crown, where Elizabeth kind of becomes queen, even though she never expected to, by this series of mishaps, there's a real sense, I think, in Aurelius that this is a gentle philosophical soul who, if anything, was made for the academy, right? but ends up in this position of power and desires very deeply to hold it well and to rule well. So I'm going to read from this really wonderful edition. It's translated and introduced by Gregory Hayes, and it's fairly recent, from the Modern Library. I'll just read from some of his introduction. So he begins with this quote from Plato, the Republic. States will never be happy until rulers become philosophers or philosophers become rulers. Now, here's Hayes. Marcus Aurelius is said to have been fond of quoting Plato's dictum, and those who have written about him have rarely been able to resist applying it to Marcus himself. And indeed, if we seek Plato's philosopher king in the flesh, we could hardly do better than Marcus, the ruler of the Roman Empire for almost 2 decades and author of the immortal Meditations. Yet the title is one that Marcus himself would surely have rejected. He never thought of himself as a philosopher. He would have claimed to be, at best, a diligent student and a very imperfect practitioner of a philosophy developed by others. As for the imperial throne, that came almost by accident. When Marcus Annius Verus was born in AD 121, bystanders might have predicted a distinguished career in the Senate or the imperial administration. They could hardly have guessed that he was destined for the imperial purple, or seen in their mind's eye the lonely bronze horseman whose upraised hand greets us from the Capitoline Hill in Rome across 2,000 years. So you get the sense, I suppose, that Hayes is a really skillful writer, and he gives a very beautiful character sketch of Aurelius, which I recommend. And I sort of evoke some of these issues here to give you an idea for who we're dealing with. Because again, and this has been a theme throughout this series, right? These are people, and they are developing their ideas out of reactions to what's going on in the world around them. And I think you can really see the reluctant emperor in Aurelius. Some of the reflections that we'll get to seem to me to suggest that he's resorting to philosophy as a way of understanding the just terrible decisions he has to make. Eventually, Rome is going to engage in these tense struggles in the east with Parthia. And there are persecutions of Christians going on in the Roman Empire at this time, although it's not clear that Aurelius really knew that much about it. He seems to have had other concerns on his mind. But in general, you get this sense of somebody surrounded by people who he's not sure how sincere they are. This is a problem in court always. And somebody who feels a great weight on his shoulders and a great weight of responsibility, and a deep, deep sense of personal inadequacy. And so Stoicism is his kind of way of grappling with the enormity of the universe and his place within it. And I think, absent Christianity, it's sort of one of the best available options for that. So we're gonna go through some of what he writes himself in Meditations. Before I do that, I will pause to say that I really am grateful that you're here. It's an amazing journey. This particular series. It was so much fun to put together. I love hearing from you. If you haven't already subscribed, do so now so you get new episodes each week at Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, wherever, on YouTube. And leave us a 5-star review. That really helps the show on iTunes. If you do that, what helps the show most of all, though, and what is really the best way at this point to break free of big tech and engage with the show, is to become a Young Heretics VIP on Locals. That's youngheretics.com/locals, where you get all sorts of extra bonus content, and you can help keep this show going. Thanks for being here. So I'll begin, in keeping with this theme of Aurelius' kind of wistful character, I'll begin with some of his most famous reflections on his own life and how he sort of treats himself and his responsibilities. This is book 6, and in the Hayes edition, it's paragraph 12. If you had a stepmother and a real mother, you would pay your respects to your stepmother, yes, but it's your real mother you'd go home to. The court and philosophy. Keep returning to it, to rest in its embrace. It's all that makes the court and you endurable. And so here you hear him kind of talking to himself. He's very critical of himself, critical especially of his sluggishness, his slowness to actually put Stoic ethics into practice, but also just of his sort of general failings, as indeed I think all of the most admirable people are. Part of how they become admirable, it seems, is by holding themselves up to these lofty ideals from which they're always falling short. So he's tormented a bit in this way. And I'll read one other passage which sort of raises some of his insecurities and his discomforts with being emperor, but also which sort of gets us into talking about his philosophy more generally. This is book 10, 36. It doesn't matter how good a life you've led. There'll still be people standing around the bed who will welcome the sad event. Even with the intelligent and good, won't there be someone thinking, finally, to be through with that old school teacher? Even though he never said anything, you could always feel him judging you. And that's for a good man. How many traits do you have that would make a lot of people glad to be rid of you? Remember that, when the time comes, you'll be less reluctant to leave if you can tell yourself, this is the sort of life I'm leaving. Even the people around me, the ones I spent so much time fighting for, praying over, caring about, even they want me gone, in hopes that it will make their own lives easier. How could anyone stand a longer stay here? So this kind of melancholy, tragic aspect of Stoicism, which arises, I think, out of an effort to keep that ataraxia, that composure, in a world that is full of injustice and that seems at all times to be assaulting you, especially if you are, the head of state and surrounded by potential backbiters, right? This tragic aspect of Stoicism is also something that it really kind of shares with Christianity to a certain extent. And Aurelius meditates constantly on death and on his own death as a way of situating himself within what he believes is this vast kind of toss and churn of the cosmos. I will say at the outset that I sort of think his cosmological outlook may be a bit scrambled with some Epicureanism. He does, believe in the logos pervading all things, as the Stoics, as I've said, do, right? That this is this whole world of bodies and inert matter animated by one governing spirit. But he also kind of parlays that into this quietist idea that, once we die, we go back to the earth, our soul goes up and eventually decomposes in much the same way that our bodies decompose. And so he's attempting, I think, to find some peace in a world that is just full of anxieties and pressures and outright misery. And so now I'll read at greater length some of the really remarkable passages in which he takes that cosmological attitude and applies it to how he thinks. He's mostly concerned with how to deal with people who suck. And I'm sure he had a lot of those, right? He's concerned with how to regard people who get on your nerves or who seem to you to be acting irrationally. And basically he thinks, this is one of the things from which, as a Stoic, he believes he should be able to detach his emotions. He doesn't think he should get angry about it. He aspires, and I think this is very noble, he aspires to an attitude that would have compassion as on his sort of detractors as fellow men. And we're going to get to the sort of aspects of Stoic philosophy that this uncovers in a second. But let's just read some of what he has to say here. This is the opening of Book 2. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood or birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. No one can implicate me in ugliness, nor can I feel angry at my relative or hate him. We were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, like the 2 rows of teeth, upper and lower. To obstruct each other is unnatural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on him, these are obstructions. You can hear some echoes of Paul's epistles, right? That we are all part of a body, we have different functions in it. Whatever this is that I am, it is flesh, and a little spirit, and an intelligence. Throw away your books. Stop letting yourself be distracted. That is not allowed. Instead, as if you were dying right now, despise your flesh, a mess of blood, pieces of bone, a woven tangle of nerves, veins, arteries. Consider what the spirit is, air, and never the same air, but vomited out and gulped in again at every instant. Finally, the intelligence. Think of it this way. You are an old man. Stop allowing your mind to be a slave, to be jerked about by selfish impulses, to kick against fate and the present, and to mistrust the future. So a lot of what we talked about in the Greek Stoicism episode is relevant here, with a little bit, again, as I say, of this sort of Epicurean flux thrown in. Before I continue, a word from another sponsor. If you follow me on Twitter, you know that my handle there is Klavan Squarebeard. I love beards, and I actually think that they're one of the sort of only places where men should really pay attention to their grooming and their personal appearance. It's it's had all this cultural significance throughout history, but it takes a lot of upkeep. It's it actually is kind of hard to shape your beard, make sure it doesn't look gross and scraggly. I use products from Mini Mustachery, so I'm really glad they're sponsoring me. They've got everything. It's not just this sort of one trick pony. There's beard wax and beard balm. There are straight razors. I love their straight razors. I'm using one these days, and it's excellent. They even sell hats. So if you want to check them out, go to minimustachery.com/heretics and use the promo code heretics, HERETICS, just like in the title, for a discount, so that they know that we sent you. Now back to the show. This idea that we are all part of one family, and that we should regard even those who fail in philosophy, who don't know what we know, with compassion, and try to explain to them why it is that they're wrong. This has a certain whiff of Christian charity to it, right? And next week, I'm going to get to the ways in which Christianity sort of engaged with Stoicism for good and ill, right? And had all sorts of interactions with the Stoics that, it may in fact have sort of influenced some of the gospel writers, but also which sort of ended up wiping Stoicism off the map in the last analysis. So the principle at work here in this sort of universal, it's sometimes called the world city, the Stoics refer to it as this universal brotherhood of man, is the principle is oikeiosis. And in Greek, oikeos, to be oikeos is to be appropriate or to be sort of related in greater or lesser degrees of intimacy. And so my immediate relatives, the people like directly related to me by blood, those are my natural oikeoi. But the Stoics believe that if you see the kind of connection of all things by the divine mind that pervades everything, then you see the oikeiosis in all humanity, that as humans, we are related to one another. It's one of the sort of few philosophies that develops this idea, this kind of cosmopolitan idea, pre-Christianity in a really rigorous and robust way. And it has to do with, I think, the monotheism of it, right? The one God who pervades all things, also creates all human beings. And so we have a duty to one another. And ultimately, what is good for us is good for us all. Now, this is kind of like true Stoicism has never been tried, because in fact, we are constantly at one another's throats, and there are ways in which our actual just sin is the only word for it, but our fallenness, our sort of messiness gets in the way of forming this harmonious, peaceful, global, kumbaya. And in fact, that's one reason why in our fallen world, right, nation states are actually still a good thing. It's actually still good to sort of limit the scope of your political association, so that you can, to a scope within which you can fittingly feel love and pride and local connection. But at the same time, we recognize in this Stoic ideal something of a virtuous aspiration to kind of recognize the spark of the human and the divine in everyone is, of course, something that we aspire to. It's not like being members of a nation precludes that, as I discussed, I think, when we talked about Chesterton and localism. I just want to sort of dwell on this for a moment because it's an aspect of Stoicism that we haven't quite emphasized as much. It becomes much more important in Roman Stoicism because you're dealing, as I've said before, right now with a republican society, which eventually becomes an empire, but which is riven with class conflict, right, with the plebs and the patricians. And it's not that there wasn't class conflict in Athens, it's just that it became this really central feature of Roman politics. And so Stoicism was this way of kind of both living in that society and acknowledging that it was probably part of the world, but also sort of finding some virtuous way of regarding one another and considering one another brothers. Stoics eventually sort of start saying, like, the slave is your brother, that you were both made by Zeus. You're both sort of imbued with divine rationality. And so again, these things are contingent in history, right? Different things become emphasized in different places and times because of the things that are going on. Let's read a little bit more of this sort of set of ideas in Aurelius. So I'm reading now the end of book 2 into the beginning of book 3. He says, human life, duration, momentary, nature, changeable, perception, dim, condition of body, decaying, soul, spinning around, fortune, unpredictable, lasting fame, uncertain. Sum it up. The body and its parts are a river, the soul a dream and mist. Life is warfare and a journey far from home. Lasting reputation is oblivion. See, you see what I'm saying here? Aurelius is right that he's not a philosopher in the sense of trying to parse out each of the doctrines of a particular school. He's picking up a lot here, I think, from older Greek philosophy as well, from Heraclitus. But ultimately, he remains a Stoic in his ethics and in his view of the world. Right? He says, what can guide us? Only philosophy, which means making sure that the power within stays safe and free from assault, superior to pleasure and pain, doing nothing randomly or dishonestly and with imposture, not dependent on anyone else's doing something or not doing it, and making sure that it accepts what happens and what is dealt to it as coming from the same place it came from, and above all, that it accepts death in a cheerful spirit as nothing but the dissolution of the elements from which each living thing is composed. If it doesn't hurt the individual elements to change continually into one another, why are people afraid of all of them changing and separating? It is a natural thing, and nothing natural is evil. So this ataraxia, this sense of acceptance of all that is governed by a rational mind, right? And then this, combined with this idea that one rational mind makes all men brothers, creates this ethos in him, which he uses to navigate his life as an emperor. this is what I mean. We're seeing now, as I've been saying this whole time, how these things are interconnected. How one's philosophical ideas, if they're good, are not just kind of floating out in some abstract space. They are integrated into one's daily experience and practice. And any philosophy worth its salt should be able to withstand that kind of daily integration. Now, here is where I think I have something of a problem with Aurelius' sort of set of ideas, just at a kind of high level. It is not just that every day more of our life is used up and less of it is left, but this too, if we live longer, can we be sure our mind will still be up to understanding the world, to the contemplation that aims at divine and human knowledge? If our mind starts to wander, we'll still go on breathing, go on eating, imagining things, feeling urges, and so on. But getting the most out of ourselves, calculating where our duty lies, analyzing what we hear and see, deciding whether it's time to call it quits, all the things you need a healthy mind for, all those are gone. So we need to hurry, not just because we move daily closer to death, but also because our understanding, our grasp of the world may be gone before we get there. There's this sense of urgency and this, again, very noble sense of duty to virtue. And yet, two problems remain. One is what I said when we started with Greek Stoicism, which is that this is actually too closed system. It is too pristine and precise, and it does not admit of the fact that things like death do cause us enormous grief. And if we can't escape that, if we ultimately can't just leave that at the door and expunge it from the human experience, then maybe it tells us something. Maybe it tells us something just like our sense perceptions tell us something. Maybe our inordinate grief at death, if it doesn't make any sense to us, right? If a hugely rational mind would say, well, death shouldn't affect us emotionally because we just evaporate and then we're gone, right? If that's what a rational person would say based on only a physical life, then maybe grief is an indication that that's not all there is, right? Maybe there's a hint in that, that death isn't supposed to happen. And so basically, I think the fact that nobody can be the perfect Stoic sage indicates that Stoicism is missing some final piece of the puzzle, which just keeps coming back to us in our emotional reaction to things, no matter how hard we try to make ourselves into these automatons. Again, it's very noble and good to seek a kind of self-control and to use Aurelius as an example of that. But there's something lacking here also in his sense when he says, well, I have to hurry, I have to be virtuous in this time. Why? Given what he has said, right? Given that he said that all things decompose and decay, and given that, that life is a blip and when it's over, it's over. Again, as I said when we talked about the Epicureans, I don't see therefore why this concern to be virtuous. Why not a concern simply to enjoy yourself? And so I think again there are inklings even in Stoicism of something beyond Stoicism, which I'm going to get to more next week. Now let's talk a little bit to close out more about this idea of oikeiosis, the universal brotherhood of man, because it's a really current issue, right? We are currently facing a global elite. Klaus Schwab is a good example, the head of the World Economic Forum, which is the sort of Davos conference. We are facing a global elite that believes that borders are outdated and that this very idea, I don't know that they would trace it here, but this is where it comes from, right? This ancient and indeed Christian and also Stoic idea that we are all one as humans, right? That it basically means that we should all just live together and be happy, and nations are outdated and they inspire all this war and they're terrible. Cicero On Duties, remember Cicero, not a Stoic himself, but an admirer of Stoicism, an admirer of Greek culture more generally, he quotes Terence, which is he's a playwright, 163 BC, in Auton Timorumenos is the name of this play. And it's this line, I am a man, homo sum, I am a human, and I consider nothing human alien to me. Nothing is a famous line, right? I am human, nothing human is alien to me. And this is basically the ethos that Aurelius is trying to cultivate, that arises out of this idea of oikeiosis, of the sort of global city. Well, why doesn't it work, right? It doesn't work in part because of this fact that we don't actually behave and never will behave as Stoic sages do. Even the best sort of Stoics, even people like Aurelius, who are very concerned to put Stoicism into practice, they have these beautiful visions of things, but never in the history of ever have we behaved like this toward one another, even though maintaining a vision of it is true and good and inspires personal actions that are hugely virtuous. Let me read again. This is from Book 10. Given the material we're made of, what's the sanest thing that we can do or say? Whatever it may be, you can do or say it. Don't pretend that anything's stopping you. You'll never stop complaining until you feel the same pleasure that the hedonist gets from self-indulgence, only from doing what's proper to human beings as far as circumstances, inherent or fortuitous, allow. Enjoyment means doing as much of what your nature requires as you can. And you can do that anywhere, a privilege not granted to a cylinder. Now, he's referring here to that chrysippin metaphor that I talked about 2 weeks ago, right? That even if we are all governed by corporeal laws, by bodies acting upon one another, we have a certain nature which is to be rational and to act in a certain way, and so we can be praised or blamed. And so he's saying, he's actually going beyond chrysippus and saying, you're more than a cylinder. You can, it says, determine your own action. It's not granted to water or fire or any of the other things governed by nature alone or by an irrational soul. As I said before, this is just a sticky point in Stoicism, right? They want ethics, they want good and bad, but they also want a completely sort of governed universe and one with rules and nothing outside of it. And this just, they kind of twist themselves to try and figure out how those both can be true. And too many things obstruct them and get in their way, but the intellect and logos are able to make their way through anything in their path by inborn capacity or sheer force of will. Keep before your eyes the ease with which they do this, the ease with which the logos is carried through all things, as fire is drawn upward or a stone falls to earth, as a cylinder rolls down an inclined plane. That's all you need. All other obstacles either affect the lifeless body or have no power to shake or harm anything, unless misperception takes over or the logos surrenders voluntarily. Otherwise, those they obstruct would be degraded by them immediately. In all other entities, when anything bad happens to them, it affects them for the worse. Whereas here a person is improved by it, if I can put it like that, and we admire him for reacting as a person should. And keep in mind that nothing can harm one of nature's citizens except what harms the city he belongs to, and nothing harms that city except what harms its law. And there is no so-called misfortune that can do that. So long as the law is safe, so is the city and the citizen. The law being the logos, right, the governing rationality of the whole world. The city being that world, and the citizen being you and me. Now, this is great, right? It's beautiful, but it doesn't actually work in practice. And so there is this like slippage and tragedy that I think is generating a lot of Aurelius self-condemnation. And again, certainly not to say that if were I in his position, I would do any better, or he lived by all accounts a quite remarkable life. But just sort of trying to point out the chinks here so that we can understand next week how it was that Christianity was able to succeed Stoicism and Epicureanism as this kind of more cogent and compelling philosophy. One reason why is tragedy, is because as the Roman Empire continued to sort of devolve into dysfunction and into crack up, as pain and suffering proved themselves immutable, as grief over death came back around. Eras much like ours, right, when we had thought that we could build this shining city, this global universe, this world without borders, and instead what we come back to again and again is the reality of infectious disease and the reality of government incompetence and despotism and overreach. There are resources, mental resources, for toughing those things out in Stoicism, but it would take Christianity to sort of allow for that tragedy to be understood, to say that, yeah, there are these beautiful visions that we have in our minds of how we can relate to one another, how the world can be constructed. But in the end, right, we don't live in that world, and behaving now as if we live in that world, rather than as if that world were somehow beyond the space and time that we currently experience. Behaving now as if we live in that world won't actually conduce to happiness. It will conduce either to social dysfunction, or if you approach it rightly, it will conduce to a kind of tragic life, like the Christian life, a life of penitence and suffering, but ultimate redemption. That's for next week. I just want to close with this nice quote from C.S. Lewis on Christianity and culture. And he says something about Wordsworth that I think applies to Aurelius too. He says, "For some souls, I believe, for my own I remember, Wordsworthian contemplation can be the first and lowest form of recognition that there is something outside ourselves which demands reverence. For the man coming up from below, the Wordsworthian experience is an advance. Even if he goes no further, he has escaped the worst arrogance of materialism. If he goes on, he will be converted." This is what I mean when I say that it's good and noble to admire Aurelius for his manly virtues, right, which are so sorely lacking. It's certainly a step up from the kind of Epicurean, just pop psychology and pop philosophy that I cited at the beginning of the last episode. It's certainly a step up from materialism, full stop, right, from just there are only atoms. Because remember that the Stoics are corporealists. They believe in bodies acting on one another, but they also have a very sort of robust idea of God and of the order in the universe. And so it's not as if, this is an evil or bad philosophy at all. I'm arguing that it's incomplete, but I'm also arguing that the influence of it upon our culture and the sort of resurgence of interest in it is actually, to me, a hopeful sign. It's like the first leaves shooting up through the snow in winter. It's a sign of people yearning for some deeper, truer experience of life beyond this obviously bankrupt kind of just empty materialism. Again, nothing against science, love science, but to use it as the whole of your outlook prompts just despair. And Stoicism, the sort of return to these online communities of self-restraint and manly virtue, these are all to the good. And we salute I salute Marcus Aurelius across the ages for having left us this record. I hope you enjoyed the tour through it. Okay. The mailbag. If you want to ask video mailbag questions, you should head over to youngheretics.com/locals and become a Young Heretics VIP. There's all sorts of extra goodies over there. Here's today's question. Seth Tower Hurd asks, I'm fairly new to the podcast, so maybe you've covered this. I have not. What was the Yale PhD game plan? Academia, or were you always going to do your own thing? This is, I don't answer that many like personal questions on the show, but this one is actually about the sort of premise of the show, of course, because I am a creature of the academy, as critical as I am of it. I went to Yale for my bachelor's. I did a PhD in Oxford, which I loved. I had fantastic professors. And I always want to stress this because when I make criticisms of the crisis in American academia right now, I don't want to be taken as saying that I resent my own education. I don't. I was unsure during the time that I was getting my PhD where I wanted to take the work that I was doing. I have always thought, I guess, that I had a gift for communicating as well as for study. And this speaks a little bit to discernment, which I think a lot of people are who are watching the show are doing, right? What's the way that the instrument that I am can sing in that Aristotelian Nicomachean ethics way where you're just being the best you. And it took me a while, actually, to figure out that the kind of stuff that I wanted to do didn't quite fit into a traditional academic mold. And the reason for that is A, because it was becoming more and more censorious in the academy more generally, but B, because part of what I love is the stuff that is really hard to get to in a professional academic job, which is this thing that we've been doing all these episodes of actually treating ancient texts, but intellectual work more generally as a real way of thinking about real life that is accountable to real life. And so when I keep stressing that we are here to be asking how life should actually go and what we should actually believe about the truth, I think that it turns out kind of sadly that the popular venues like the ones that I'm working on now, and I write for some pretty like heady publications. It's not like they're dumb or anything, but just I like talking to people about their lives, and so the dysfunction of wokeness and cancel culture is one thing, and I deplore it. I think it's a terrible deprivation of the riches of the West. However, there's something else too, which is just that those riches themselves have kind of become seemingly the province of an elite. And whereas, of course, expert study is important and you need people that are going to devote their lives to like carrying on these traditions and learning about the great authors that we discuss here, you also you need to be able, without shame, to make those things accessible to folks. I mean, this is why I love to hear from you when you are like, and this, I'm taking this from real life. This is not a caricature. Like I hear from you that you're listening on your tractor or at the gym or with your kids, right? And look, I know I'm an egghead. I know I'm a weirdo. And so the fact that I am entering into your life, you who are the like backbone of American society or wherever you are, right? You who are actually out there living in the world and doing things that will matter. The fact that I am bringing to that something of worth from these deep traditions makes me feel like I am just like really hitting that note that I was designed to hit. And so as a long-winded answer to your question, no, it takes time to discern these things. I did not know immediately that this podcast or the work at the Claremont Institute that I do is what I wanted to do. I'm sure that it is. I feel very specifically guided and directed by God in each new step, but I am not somebody who plans these things out years ahead. I don't really advocate that either. So if you're out there thinking about like how you can live out your vocation, I would suggest being a little bit flexible because you'll find it organically through your own flourishing, as well as, of course, through the advice of those around you and so forth. That was a nice question. Thank you for asking, and thank you for listening or watching if you're watching. This is Young Heretics. If you like the show, you will love the Claremont Institute, which is where I work. We publish 2 publications: the literary magazine, the Claremont Review of Books, and our online, The American Mind, is our online presence. It's a great institute. I love working there. We defend and recover the American ideals, and you can support us if you like at claremont.org/donate. Let them know in the notes if you do that we sent you. All right. Thanks again for listening. This is Young Heretics. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.